In this lab, we're trying to find two unkeyed headers we can combine to poison the cache. And I'll show you how you can find those unkeyed headers by using Param Miner, so without consulting the lab hints. And I'll also show you why we can't find that second unkeyed header the first time we scan with Param Miner, because that explains an important detail about how Param Miner works behind the scenes. So let's switch to burp and go to proxy and HTTP history. And we want the GET request for the home page and send it to repeater and switch to repeater. Now, the first question we want to ask of the home page is, when we send the request, is, are you a cache oracle? Because a cache oracle gives away caching related information about the response. And we can see that it is a cache oracle because it told us that we have a cache miss because the age is 0 and the max age is 30. If we resend the request, we can see that we get a cache hit. The age for the cache response is 18 seconds and it'll expire in 12 seconds when it reaches the max age. So that tells us the home page is a cache oracle, and we can continue to use the home page to probe for weaknesses. Now, the next thing we want to do is add a cache buster, and we want to add one for two reasons. One is we don't want to impact live users that are visiting the home page. We want to separate our work from live users that are just normally using the application. So that's one. Second reason is that when we're playing around with those unkeyed headers, we're trying to inject different values and we're trying to see what the effect is on the response. So sometimes we want to make sure that we don't get a cached response, and if we make a modification to the cache buster, we'll get an uncached response because we'll get a cache miss. So let's go over to the left here to the request and go to the request line and just add a query parameter. It can be anything, but I'm choosing CB for cache buster and adding the text cache buster to the value and then just some random input. And then I'll send the request and we get a cache miss. Send it again, we get a cache hit. But if we make any modification to the cache buster here, to the value, we get a cache miss again. So that confirms that we can use the query string here as a cache buster and we can safely continue our probing without affecting end users. Now let's try and find the first unkeyed header. So I'm going to right click on the request and then go to extensions, Param Miner, guest params, and then guest headers. And then you want to leave the defaults here and just click OK to initiate the scan. I'm going to click cancel because I've already ran the scan before. So if I go to, because I'm using the professional edition, my scan results are under target. And then I can see it here on the right. So status code, cache poisoning 0. The Param Miner found the X forwarded scheme header. If we're using the community edition, you can find, so initiating the scan works the same way, but the scan results are in a different location. You'll have to go to extensions, to the installed ones, go to Param Miner, and then instead of the details tab, which is open by default, go to output, and then you can find the X forwarded scheme header right here. So let's see what this header does. So I'm going to go back to the other burp and then go to repeater. I'm going to open a new tab in repeater, and then I'm going to add the X forwarded scheme header underneath the host header. So a scheme is the portion at the start of a URL that tells whether it's FTP or HTTP or HTTPS. So let's say that it's HTTPS and then send a request. And we can see a cache miss, we can see a cache hit if we send again, but we don't really see any changes in the content here. But if we change the X forwarded scheme to, let's say, HTTP and then resend the request, but we get a cache hit, remember this is an unkeyed header, so we need to modify the cache buster to make sure we don't get a cache hit. So if you modify the cache buster and then the X forwarded scheme and resend the request, we now get a cache miss, but we also get a 302 found. So what we find is that the backend is sending a 302 redirect every time that it finds that the X forwarded scheme is set to anything that is not HTTPS. So if I modify the cache buster as well and resend this request, we see that same 302 found again. And we can see the location here, so the location header. This is interesting because if we can, in combination with this X forwarded scheme header, which generates a 302 found by the backend, if we can also control the host portion here, then we can actually turn this 302 on-site redirect into an off-site redirect. Now, to change it to an on-site redirect, we'll need another header. So let's try and discover a second unkeyed header. And I'll explain why we need to do that with a second scan, but we need to use the request here as the base where we have X forwarded scheme set to not HTTPS, so that the base for our scan is the request that actually generates a 302 response. So right click, go to extensions, Param Miner, guest params, and guest headers again. and then click OK. So if we go to target, then we go to secret input header here, and I think we have X forwarded scheme here at the bottom. And then the second one is X forwarded host with a bit of data added after. But we also find a normal X forwarded host header. And then in the community edition, I based my scan. So on this repeater, if I go to repeater, you have the X forwarded scheme header here with not HTTPS set. And then I did a scan via extensions, param miners, guest params, and then guest headers. And then clicked OK. I'm going to click cancel now because I already have the results here. If I go to extensions and then to Param Miner and the output tab, you can see that we found the X forwarded host header here. So let's see if we can use that X forwarded host header to turn our on-site redirect into an off-site redirect. So I'm going to go back to repeater, and then I'm going to add the header X forwarded host, and I'm going to set it to example.com. So let's see, before, without the X forwarded host header, we had an on-site redirect here. If I send a request again, we can see that the location changed. So we're now redirecting to example.com. So let's see if we actually visit this, see if it works. So go to the lab, paste this, and then we get redirected to example.com, and the cache buster is added as well. So that offsite redirect is working. But now I want to show you why we didn't find the X forwarded host header in our first scan using Param Miner. So if we go back to burp, I'm just going to create a copy of this request to work in. And then if we remove the X forwarded scheme header, actually let's remove the X forwarded scheme header first. And then I'm going to cut the X forwarded host header as well. Just send this request. So we get a cache miss. We get a content length of 10,832. If I then add the X forwarded host header and change the cache buster as well and send a request again, we get a cache miss, but you can see the content length hasn't changed. So nothing changes in the response when we add the X forwarded host header. It's only when we add the X forwarded scheme header that the response actually changes. So if we change this to anything that is not HTTPS, then we can see, and we actually have to modify the cache buster as well, then we can see that the response changes. And that's essentially how Param Miner works and how it discovers unkeyed headers in most situations. It's sending a normal request, for example, without the X forwarded host header. It looks at the response, and then it adds the X forwarded host header with a random value and looks at whether the response has changed at all. Because the X forwarded host header, as we just saw, by itself doesn't actually change the response, then Param Miner can't know whether it's an unkeyed header, yes or no. It was only when we had already added the X forwarded scheme header, which by itself, if the value is not HTTPS, it effectively changes the response, because instead of getting a 200 OK with content, we get a 302 found. So by itself, X forwarded scheme, it already changes the response. So that's why Param Miner knew even from the first run that this was an unkeyed header. But it was only when we added the X forwarded host header after we already had the X forwarded scheme header that the X forwarded host header was effectively changing something in the response, because it was changing the host portion here in the location header. And after that, Param Miner knew, okay, this is an unkeyed header as well, because we still keep getting a cache hit, even if we make changes to the X forwarded host header. Now let's see if we can use these two headers combined to cause an offsite redirect for a JavaScript file. So I'm going to go to proxy again, and we have a resources.js tracking.js file here. So I'm going to send that to repeater, switch to repeater, and then I'm going to send a request just to make sure that we get a cache hit. I see that it's at age 28, so I'm just going to make sure that we refresh it again. So we get a cache hit. I'm going to add a cache buster because I want to make sure that we're not impacting live users. And we get a cache miss after adding that cache buster. So that confirms the cache buster is working. And we're going to go to the previous request and see if we can copy these two headers that we found previously and see if we can turn this into an offsite redirect. So I'm going to add them and then send a request, but we get a cache hit. So we need to change the cache buster here and send it again. And yep, we get a 302 found to example.com and to resources.js tracking.js. So let's make sure now that we modify the redirect here. So we're not redirecting to example.com, but to our own exploit server. So I'm going to go back to the lab. We had the redirect to example.com here. So I'm just going to go back and then open the exploit server in a new tab. So this is the host portion of our exploit server. I'm going to copy that, switch back to burp, and then modify the X forwarded host here to be our exploit server. Then I'm going to go back to the lab because we also want to make sure that we update the body here, and we want to turn it into, or create an alert for document.cookie. And we also want to modify our path because the path that's going to be requested is this one here. So I'm just going to copy that from the request, and then I'm going to paste that here and store it. And then I'm going to send a request here with our cache buster just to make sure that the redirect is to our own exploit server. Yep, that's working. So I'm going to remove the cache buster now and then resend the request. And we get a cache miss, but now we get a cache hit, and it's redirecting to our exploit server. So let's go back to the lab and then refresh the page. We get the alert pop-up. As you already saw, congratulations, you've solved the lab. So there we go. I hope this was helpful to you, and thank you for watching.